All right, Web31, welcome to pre-processing day 2. So we're going to start with this code pen again. It should look very familiar. It's all of the things that we were doing yesterday. Today we're going to go through 3 new concepts. So we're going to take mix-ins a step further with parametric mix-ins. We are going to learn about escaping, which is just fancy ways to store media queries in a variable. And then we're going to talk about importing. Importing is probably going to be the most difficult thing we do today. It's not super hard. It's just a different concept to wrap your mind around. So let's get started. We'll open up this guided project. I wanted to take a minute to talk about nesting because I know quite a few people found nesting a little confusing yesterday. So I'm going to get a quick thread going in Slack here. For questions about nesting. So if you have any particular questions related to nesting, anything that you'd like me to do a quick review of, please post it in that thread and we'll do that before we get started on today's concepts. So if we take a look at this code, we can see that it's been nested for us. So everything inside of the header is nested inside of the header. Everything like media queries, like different elements, so the H1. What I find really, really helpful is putting those comments in here so we know where things open and close. So for example, this closes the media query for the header. Okay, the header should close down here. The nav closes here. This closes the first anchor. All right, we've got some questions here. I am a little confused about how to name everything I nest. So you're not naming it when you're nesting it. So for example, if you have a class with a section of bottom content, if I wanted to change the background color of this class, let's see how I would call that or how you would name that when you nest it. So that is inside of main content. It's a section that's inside of main content. So let's find our main content. It's here. The main content curly bracket closes down here. So we'll say this closes main content. Okay, so I can put it anywhere inside of that curly bracket. So let's just put it here. So I would say, I can just call the class name here. So bottom content. Okay, I don't have to say main dot main dash content space bottom content because it's already nested inside of main content. So that is implied. Okay, and I could say something like background dash color purple. Okay, so now the bottom content, the background colors changed to purple. So I'm just putting it inside of the curly brackets of whatever its parent is. And then Carmen says, I honestly don't think that I did it right. How do you make the decision about what to nest? Yeah, really good question. So I would stick to nesting like just sections. So any general content, we scroll up here. By general stuff, general styles, I mean like anything on the HTML. That's probably too big to nest. General styles, like it applies to all of the H1s, all of the H2s, all of the H3s. Like that's probably too big to nest. Something that applies to all of the images or all of the paragraphs on the page, they're too general to nest. What I'm concerned about is I would look at my HTML and I would go section by section and I would just nest the sections. That's the only thing that I would put inside of other things. And Jason says, any tips for using mix-ins effectively? Yeah, we'll get to mix-ins in just a moment. I just wanted to cover nesting. Tracy, I used comments to mark where things close as you suggested, but my comments were all out of place when Les was converted over to the CSS file. Will that be a problem for other developers who need to review the code at a later date? Yeah, I would probably go back and fix those comments if you have some time. And the way that I would keep track of comments is just as soon as you open and close curly brackets, I would just write the comments right away so that you know exactly what that closing curly bracket belongs to. Is it a good idea to nest media queries? I found that it was confusing to keep track of. Yes, media queries are definitely one thing that you'll want to nest. So why do I want to nest media queries? Because when I look at the header, I want to see all of the styles for the header at every single screen size. So it's all right there in front of me. I don't have to go through my media queries and look to see if there's any specific styles for the header. They're just all right here. So media queries are definitely one thing that you'll want to nest. We'll get some more practice with this today, but let's move on to parametric mix-ins and how those work. And we'll talk about nesting a little bit more after that if you still have some lingering questions. Okay, so let's recap mix-ins. Yesterday, we created this mix-in called center, and we used it to center our button. How would I go about doing that? So let's take a look at the HTML and what is the first step. So how do I center my button? So I'm applying the style display flex, justify content center, align item center. So how would I center my button? Yeah, I'd have to apply center to the parent. So right now the button doesn't have a parent, so let's wrap a parent around it. So div.button parent. Okay, we can take this closing div and put it after the button. We'll say Shift Tab to fix the spacing. Okay, while we're on the subject of nesting, I could nest that button inside of button parent if I wanted to, and I would do that like this. So I could say dot button parent. Okay, I can open my curly bracket here. I can take this and I can close it all the way down here. Shift Tab to fix the spacing, because the Book a Flight button is inside of the button parent. So it's the same thing with our CSS. So this closes the button parent. Okay, so everything that's inside of the button parent goes inside of those curly brackets. So that's a good way to think about it. Okay, so let's apply that mix-in of center. Save, and if we scroll down, our button should be centered. Awesome. What were these parentheses for yesterday when we were talking about mix-ins? What were they for? Why were they valuable? Why did we want to use them both when we defined the mix-in and when we called it in? Yeah, so we can use it for parameters, and we will use that for parameters today, but for yesterday we weren't using any parameters, but it was because we wanted our compiler to compile these mix-ins. So yesterday we were putting these parentheses here because of consumption. We wanted these mix-ins to be consumed by the compiler. We didn't want them to be random classes that stayed on top of our code. Okay, so we've got a mix-in called center. It centers a button. It does one thing. It does one thing really well. The problem here is that it's extremely hard-coded. So you might be thinking, well, I wanted it to center the button. That's fine. That's exactly what I wanted it to do. But it's only doing one thing here. So I'm going to introduce you to the concept of parametric mix-ins. And that is a way to make our mix-ins a little bit more reusable. So here we have parameters. Okay, so we have @j and @a. These are placeholder values for the arguments that we're going to pass in later. So what could we pass in for @j and @a? What arguments could we pass in here? Yeah, we could pass in center. We could pass in center space around. We could pass in space between. We could pass in flex start, flex end, etc. Okay, so let's see what that would look like. So we would take custom layout. We would call it in here where our button is in place of center. So custom layout. And here we would pass in our arguments. So let's say flex end center. Okay, so now our button has moved to the end here. So this code here is much more reusable. So now I can use flex end and center. I can use center and center. I can pass in any values that I want here. And I could reuse this custom layout over and over and over again whenever I needed to use display flex and the justify and align arguments for display flex, or properties rather. Okay, so what matters here is the order in which we pass in the arguments. So we could call these parameters anything we want. So I can call this banana, I can call this, I can call this apple. Okay, and it's still working down here. So what we call these things doesn't matter. They're just placeholder values. But we probably want to call them something that makes sense, because the next developer is going to come in here and they're going to say, like, what is banana? What is apple? I have no idea what this means. So even @j and @a aren't great names for our parameters. So what, I'm going to get a thread going here. What could we call these? What are some better names for these? Yeah, I would say justify and align. Okay, and we can change this to justify and align. Okay, that makes more sense to me because the next person that comes here is going to understand what justify and align means. We could also add like flex direction and direction. Okay, we could add @direction. Okay, so these are just placeholder values. And then the arguments get passed in when we call our parametric mix-in here. Okay, so again, the order matters. First, we're doing flex direction, then we're doing justify, then we're doing align items. Okay, so this is much more reusable than just saying center, where our only option is to center something. Okay, I'm going to stop here for a moment. I want to do a example of this when we come back from the break, more of like a real world example. But if you have some questions so far, I want you to get them into Slido so that we can address those before we see a more robust example of this. So I'm going to put 5 minutes on the timer. So get those lingering questions into Slido, and then we'll see a more real world example of this after the break. Okay, welcome back, Web31. So let's answer some questions. So Wei asks, do you have to give a value to each parameter when we call it, or are there default values? Really good question. So we can actually set default values, and I want to show you what that looks like. So if we wanted this custom layout to default to flex direction row and justify content center and align items center, this is how we would set default values. Okay, so if I just came down here and I called custom layout and I didn't give it any values here, it would just default to those default values. Okay, if I wanted to change justify content, but I didn't want to change the flex direction or align items, then I could say at justify flex end. Okay, so then I would have to actually specify the thing that I'm wanting to change. We'll see another example of that. So don't worry if you didn't get all of that. We're going to see another example of that. We're going to use it more. Vicky asks, if we use at justify, do we not ever need to specify center? We absolutely have to specify center. So we would specify center here when we call this in, when we call in our arguments. So there's a difference between parameters, which are our placeholder values, and arguments are the actual value that we pass in. So I'm going to write that as a note because this translates to JavaScript as well. So parameters, example at justify. These are placeholder values. What matters is the order. Okay, and then arguments. These get passed in when the mixin is used. Okay, and an example would be center. Okay, so we would replace justify with center. So these are just placeholders, these parameters. Okay, let's see a real world example of this. So a question earlier was, when do we use mix-ins, or when is it a good idea to use mix-ins? And the answer to that is when you see a reusable design pattern. So sometimes as new developers, we like to create 25 mix-ins from the first line of code that we write because we've only reused something once. In practice, that's not great. I wouldn't try to create a mix-in from the very first line of code. I would start to create mix-ins when you start to see reusable design patterns. So I'm going to give you a real world scenario here. So you are the button builder for the first part of your career. You have to build 100 different buttons across 50 different pages of a website. And so you would have to code these buttons 100 different times. There's a couple problems with that. One, it's very monotonous, so it's boring. And two, it opens up the floodgates for human error. So that is where a parametric mix-in comes in really handy, because now we have one button that rules all of the buttons. And I'm going to show you what that looks like. So I'm going to come up here and create a parametric mix-in, and I'm going to call it custom button. Okay, and inside of custom button, I'm going to take all of these styles that we wrote for this book of flight button, and I'm going to paste them inside of there. So let me grab all of these styles, including the media queries. And I'm going to paste them inside of custom button. Okay, save. All right, so what are some things that we might want to change in our buttons? Well, one thing is probably the background color. So I'm going to create a parameter here called BG color. Okay, and I'll add it up here. Okay, I also might want to change the width of the button. Maybe I don't want them all to be 200 pixels. So here I could call this size. Okay, and another thing that I might want to change is the text color, because it looks pretty good. Black text looks pretty good on a light color background, but on a dark black background, the black text might be hard to read. So I'm going to change the color here, and we'll call this font color. Okay. Okay, and then we can set some default values here. So remember, if we're setting default values, we can put a colon and then set our default value. So main color is going to be our default value. Our default size is going to be 200 pixels. And our default font color is going to be black. Okay, I'm going to come and create a couple more buttons in the HTML. So we've got a book a flight button. Let's also create a cancel button. So button dot cancel. So we'll give it the class of cancel. Cancel your flight. Okay, and then let's create a check-in button as well. So we'll say button dot check-in, and we'll say check-in. Okay, so now we've got 3 buttons here. One of our buttons is styled. So instead of writing those 20 lines of code over and over and over again for each button, I can come down here and I can say, for example, dot cancel. So I'm calling the button of cancel. Custom button, which is my mix-in. And now this is automatically styled for me. Okay, but I can change things. I don't have to use the default settings. I can change the background color. So if I scroll back up here to my mix-in, we can see I can change the background color, I can change the size, and I can change the font color. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's pass in different arguments. So background color, let's say it's green. Size, we can say 300 pixels, and font color, we can say something like white. Okay, so now in one line of code, I've just created and styled an entire button. And I've saved myself about 20 lines of code. Okay, it's got the hover from the old button, so we could go and change that as well. We could just change that in the mix-in. So hover, we'll say background color should equal at font color, and the color that can equal at BG color. So we can just switch them on hover. Okay. I can also style that check-in button really, really quickly. So I'm going to come down here and say dot check-in. And I can call custom btn. Okay, and now I can pass in different arguments here. So I can say blue. I can say, I don't know, 200 pixels and sky blue. Okay, so now again, I've just styled a button really, really, really quickly. So if you were creating, 100 different buttons across 50 different pages, this would be a much more efficient way to create them than to write these 25 or 30 lines of code out 150 times or 100 times. So even here with this book a flight button, I can delete all of this stuff. And I can just say .custom. Oh, I need to delete this stuff down here too. I've got an extra media query in there. There we go. So .custom btn. Okay, so I've just saved myself about 60 lines of code. Okay, I'm going to give you a chance to try this on your own. So I would like you to create a parametric mixin for fonts. It needs to take 2 arguments. So one for the font size and one for the font family. Bonus points if you store the font family in a variable first before you call it in. And then I want you to apply this parametric mixin to the body of your website. So let me put you in your breakout groups. Okay, go ahead and join those rooms. And I'm going to put 6 minutes on the clock for you just to give you some extra time, and I'll see you in 6 minutes. All right, welcome back. Let me know how that breakout went for you. And are we starting to see how useful these parametric mix-ins can be? If you had trouble completing that breakout and you have a question as to why something might not have worked the way you thought it would, please go post that question in Slido. We're going to take this up as a class, and then we're going to address any questions that you have. So there's about 38 people back in the classroom, so I want to see about 38 replies on that thread. How did this breakout go? Okay. All right, it looks like everyone's back. Okay, most people not bad. Some people saying they weren't specific enough. No worries. Let's take this up together, and then we can see what your code looks like in comparison. Okay, so we wanted to create a parametric mix-in for fonts. It needs to take 2 arguments, so one for the size and one for the font family. And bonus points if you store the font family in a variable before you call it in. And then we're going to apply this to our body. Okay, so first let's make a parametric mix-in here. I'm just going to put it here on top of this custom layout. We'll call it font. Okay, and it took 2 parameters, so one for font size, we can say at size, and one for font family, we can say at fam. Okay, and then we've got to pass these parameters in here. Okay, next we wanted to grab a font, so let's go to Google Fonts. Fonts. Okay. I'm actually going to grab 2 fonts here. So I'll grab this one. Okay. And I'm also going to grab another one for the headings. It looks like it's a similar font. Let's see here. Let's grab a sans serif or a monotype. Yep, we'll take this one. It's not letting me add more than one font here. There we go. Okay, so we'll embed this. It's only letting me add one font here. They've switched up Google Fonts a little bit. I've got to figure out how to add these properly. Select this style. Ah, there we go. Okay, so we can import these fonts. We're going to store these fonts in a variable. Okay, so we can say at main font and at heading font. Okay, so the main font, let's make it that mono font, PT mono, there we go. We're gonna add that to our variable. And we'll go back and grab the other font family, and we're gonna add that to our heading variable. Okay, so we'll save that. So now we've stored our fonts in a variable. Okay, now we want to apply this parametric mix-in to our body, and I'm also going to apply it to our headings. So we can write a rule for body, and we can say font, and let's say at, first we needed a size, so we can say 18 rem, or 1.8 rem. Okay, and we can say at main font. Okay, so now our font has changed. Save. And we can do the same thing here. So we can get rid of font size because we're actually going to use that in our mix-in. So we can say font to rem, and we can say at heading font. Okay, so now our headings are different. So I'm going to save that. So I'll go back to my code for a minute so you can compare. So we created a mix-in called font, and we're passing in two parameters, one for the size and one for the font family. Next, we went to Google Fonts and grabbed a couple of fonts and imported them using this import URL here. And then we stored those fonts in variables. So we stored a main font, and we stored a heading font. And then we took this mix-in and we applied it to the body. And here's where we're passing in our arguments. So our argument for size was 1.8 rem. Our argument for font family was main font. And then with heading, 2.2 rem and heading font, we're passing in as our arguments. Okay, so if you've got questions about this, please get them into Slido. I'm going to stop here and answer some questions now before we move on to our next topic. Are parametric mix-ins similar to components? Like you make a master component that can be slightly altered to make new ones, but the master stays the same. Yeah, I'm not sure everybody understands what a component is, but you can think of them that way. I like to think of them as being similar to functions. And functions, not everyone might understand those yet either, but we'll be talking about functions tomorrow in JavaScript. But basically the idea of parameters and arguments are the same here. So the parameters are placeholders, and then when we call the mix-in, or in tomorrow's case, when we invoke the function, that's when we would pass in our actual arguments or the actual values. Bill says, can you use JavaScript to pass a parameter from the user to a parametric mix-in? So no, this isn't JavaScript. This is less. So let's not get ahead of ourselves here. We will be getting to JavaScript tomorrow, but we're not talking about how JavaScript actually interacts with CSS in this unit. So you guys will be talking about that a little bit more in unit 2. So really good question, but let's not get too ahead of ourselves here. All right. I'm going to stop here. That is parametric mix-ins. I'm going to give you a short break. We're going to talk about escaping when you get back. So I'll see you in 5 minutes. All right, welcome back, Web31. So we've got another question in here. Can mixins called on one less file be used in other less files in the same directory? So yes, good question. The answer is yes. We're going to get into how and why that works in a little bit when we talk about importing. Okay, next thing I want to talk about is escaping. And let's take a look at our documentation here. And let's click on escaping. And escaping is basically a way to store a string inside of a variable. A string is like a group of words, for example. It's contained inside of quotations. We can use single or double quotes. And the syntax for this is the tilde, so that is beside the one key, tilde, single or double quote, and then whatever your string is inside of there. So we use escaping to store media queries inside of variables. The problem is that we cannot use any reserved keywords, and a reserved keyword in CSS is @media. So we can't store @media inside of a variable. What we can store is everything that comes after the @media. So let's see what I mean by that. So if we scroll through our code, we can see that one thing that repeats over and over and over again is our media queries. And if we want to change them, we really only want to change them in one place and have them update everywhere. So we can't take this whole thing and store it inside of a variable because @media is a reserved keyword. This already has a meaning in CSS. What we can do is we can take everything after the @media and we can store it in a variable in a special way called escaping. So that would look like this. Okay, so I'm going to take this part of the media query, this max width 515 pixels. I'm going to scroll up and I'm going to say @phone, okay, and then tilde, single or double quotes, pick one and stay consistent. And then I'm going to store the second half of that media query inside of that variable, inside of the quotes. Okay, now I can go through and replace anything that is max width 515 pixels with @phone. And let's see, there's seems to be an error here because my code just broke. Nope, there we go. Just needed to refresh. Okay, so anywhere that I see 515 pixels, I'm going to delete that and I'm going to replace it with @phone. Okay, we can make a second one for smaller phones, so we'll do that in a second. But I'm going to go through all of my code here, and anytime I see a media query with 515 pixels, I'm going to replace it with @phone. Okay, @phone. There's one here. So you guys can do this with me. @phone, @phone. Okay, and now I can save. Okay, and I'm going to go up here and create one more for the smaller phone. So I'll say @small phone. Let me just make sure that there's no error here. Oops, there we go. @small phone, we're going to say tilde, single or double quotes. Again, pick one and be consistent. Max dash width 400 pixels. Okay, and we can go and replace that one media query that is 400 pixels with @small phone. Okay, now if we drag this, we can see that those media queries are still working. Okay. So why go through all the work to do this we'll say you're working at your company, the marketing team has done some research, they've researched all the common breakpoints, they figure that 515 pixels is a great breakpoint. You've designed your application, you've written all your code, and then the marketing team comes back to you and says, actually, we made a mistake. Most of our users use a screen size of 530 pixels. Okay, so now you don't want to go through and find every single 515 pixel media query. You can just update it here to 530 pixels, and all of those other media queries will automatically be updated. So it's the same idea of a variable. It's something that's used throughout your site, and you really only want to have to update it in one place. Okay, so now our breakpoint is 530 pixels instead of 515 pixels. So that is escaping, and I really only ever use it for media queries. Okay. All right, last thing I want to talk to you about, and then I want to spend some time doing a little review on everything we've learned so far with less. The last thing I want to talk about is importing. And I'm going to have you open up this project so that we can talk about importing. So let me share that again, but it was shared at the beginning. So you can scroll up, or you can click this link here in Slack to open that up. Okay, so this file is a read-only file, meaning that we can't edit it, but that's okay. We don't need to edit it. We just want to see how things are working here. So I'm going to open up less, and notice that we've got all of these different files inside of the less folder. Okay, so if I move this down a little bit and I click on these files, we can see we've got contact.less, we've got cta.less, which is all of the call to action section styles. We've got footer.less, which is all of the footer styles. We've got header with all the header styles. Okay, and then we still have our index.less. So in our index.less file, we have imported all of those other files in here. Okay, so when we tell LessWatch compiler to watch files, we are still only getting them to watch the index.less file. This index.less file is technically watching all of our other files now that we've imported these files here. Okay, the syntax for import looks exactly like this. So it's the word at import, it's the file name without the .less extension, and then there's a semicolon at the end. Mistakes that usually get made here is that our brains think that we're writing in a CSS file, so sometimes we like to put a colon after the import. That will break everything. So if your files are not importing correctly, just double check that your syntax is correct, because that's usually the #1 mistake that gets made today. Okay, what matters here is the cascade. So remember that CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheet. That means the browser reads your style sheet from the top down. So what we want here is to tell these files how they should land on our CSS style sheet. Okay, so first we're gonna import the variables and then the mix-ins. This doesn't really matter because these things get consumed by the compiler. But we want to be able to come here and the next developer sees, okay, there's a variable file that I should probably go look at and familiarize myself with. And there's a mix-in file that I should probably go look at and familiarize myself with. So if we look at mix-ins, all of our mix-ins would be held there. And if we look at variables, all of our variables would be held there. Okay, the next thing that we want to import is our reset, because we want our reset to go at the very top of our style sheet. Got a thread here. Why do we want our reset at the top? Why do we care where the reset is on our style sheet? Why do we want it at the top? Yeah, because of the cascade. Otherwise, we're going to reset all the styles that we just wrote. Okay, so we want our reset to be at the top of our style sheet. Next, we're going to import our general styles. So I'm going to get another thread going here. What are general styles? So when I say we're importing general styles, what would we put in that general styles file? Yeah, element level styles, things like body, things like HTML. So if we open up these general styles, we've got HTML and body, we've got all of our H1s to H5, we've got our container, which wraps around the entire site. So those big styles that apply very generally, those styles that we're not nesting, okay? These are general styles. So they usually go right after our reset. Then we import in the order that things appear on a page usually. This doesn't matter so much. The order in which we import header, footer, etc. doesn't matter so much because the things in our footer file should not really impact the things in our header file. Okay, so if I open up footer, none of these styles should matter to our header. So it shouldn't really matter what order we import the rest of that stuff, but just it makes sense to import it the way it appears on the web page. So first our header, then our call to action, then our main content, then our footer. Okay. So basically we're breaking up our website into different pieces and we're working in individual files. Okay, this is very, very common with pre-processing. So if you were hired to just work on the main content of a site, you would never have to touch the header, the footer, any other part of the site. You would only be touching probably the variable and the mix-in file to familiarize yourself with them, and then you would be working just in that one file. So I don't know how many of you were getting annoyed today with me scrolling up and down through all of this code. I know that I find it quite annoying, and we only have 212 lines of code here. Imagine a site with 8,000 lines of code and you're constantly scrolling up and down looking for things. So by importing our files and by working in separate files for separate parts of our website, it's just a way to keep things more organized and cleaner. Okay, it also minimizes the risk of making a mistake because if you're working in this main content file, you're not accidentally going to delete something in the footer because you're not touching that file. All right, so let's take a look at today's project. We're working on the FunBus website today. And if we take a look at the design file, we've got a desktop design and we've got a mobile design. Okay. If we look at our HTML file, we can see that some of the website has already been built for us. So it's just the navigation that we're building. And then we have to make it responsive. Okay, if we open up our less folder, you can see now we've got tons of different less files in here. Okay, so this is where reading this README file comes in really handy because it tells us exactly how these files should be imported into our index.less file. So let's do this together. We'll follow the directions and we can get this project set up and ready to start working on. So the first thing we need to do is that git flow, we need to fork. So I want everybody to fork with me. Okay, and then you can go into settings and manage access. And you can add your TL as a collaborator. Okay, then you want to go back to your forked version of this repo. and you're going to clone it down to your computer. So I'm going to copy this. Go ahead and take a minute and get caught up. I'm just going to open up my terminal. Oops. I'll make my terminal a bit bigger so everyone can see it. Okay, you're going to CD into where you want to put this repo. And then you can type git clone and paste the repo. You're going to CD into the project. And then you are going to git checkout -b, your first and last name. Okay, and then I'm going to open this up in VS Code. So I'm going to get everybody to give me a thumbs up on this thread when you have cloned and created a branch and you have the project open in VS Code. Okay, I'm still waiting for more than half the class, so give me a thumbs up when you've gotten that done. Okay, so we've done all of this. We've gone through our Git flow. We've done task 1. Task 2 is we need to set up our preprocessor. And the first thing we're going to do is type less c-b, and we should get a version of less here. Okay, that tells us that we have less installed and that we're good to go. Okay, if we go back to task 2, the next thing we're going to do is run our less watch compiler command. So less watch compiler less css index.less. Okay, tells us the command right here. Less watch compiler less css index.less. We are still only watching this index.less file, and we are importing everything into our CSS file. So we're not watching every .less file. We are just watching this index.less file. This index.less file is watching all of those other files for us because we are using that import rule. So if we make a change in another file, the import passes that through the index.less file and tells it how to land on our final CSS file. So I'm going to hit enter here. So now we're watching directory for file changes. Okay, the next thing that we want to do is import our files here. And it tells us the order in which to import. This is where you might want to save this project or bookmark this project so that you can refer back to this, refer back to the syntax. So we want to import here. We're going to go to .less, index.less. Okay, and the first import we're making is variables, mixins, reset. So let's do that together. At import. Okay, variables.less is just variables. Okay, and let's just double check that syntax. There we go. So single or double quotes should be fine. Okay, save. It's recompiling. So if we had anything in our variables file, which I don't think we have anything. Oh, we do. Okay, so we're not going to see that because those are consumed by the compiler. The reset we should be able to see. So let's continue importing here. At import mixins, at import reset. Okay, so if I save this, now I should see that reset in here, which I do. Okay, and then we would continue our cascade here. So the next thing is global navigation footer homepage. Okay, so I'm going to let you guys do that part on your own. But we want to do this first before we start working in any of these files, because if we start working in these files and they're not imported, they are not going to be compiled into CSS. Okay, I'm going to stop here for a minute. I noticed there's some questions, so let's answer those questions, and then we can do a quick review of everything that we've learned so far with less. Okay, Alexander says, which is better, at media, min width, at breakpoint, or at mobile, min width? So I would say the second one is better because it's less writing. Because otherwise you're writing out min width in those brackets every single time. So I would say the less writing you have to do, the less room for error. So I would probably choose the second one. The second one is probably a better idea. But really, it doesn't matter. Is it best practice to break down each section of the page into its own less sheet and import it into the index.less file? Yes. Yep, so I would keep all of my header styles in one file. So remember before we were going to our index.css page and we were writing comments, we were writing like header styles here, about section styles here. So everywhere you would have written one of those comments, I would now instead put those things in their own file. Okay, so yes, each section of the site, I would say, gets its own file. In this case, these files have already been created for you, so you're just going to work in the files that you were given. Just to be clear, we import our files into index.less first before we start editing them. Lauren, you are correct. And the reason why we do that is because if we don't import our files here first, then we're not going to see any changes in our files. So for example, if I went into general, I don't know if we have general styles here, homepage, and I said body, background dash color, pink. Okay, and I saved this. If I look at this index.css, nothing happened here and nothing changed here because it hasn't been imported into my index.less file, so the compiler isn't watching it and it's not compiling it to CSS. Okay, it's not compiling it because it's not watching it. So once I say at import homepage and I save this, then if I look in my index.css, see if it's saved here, I should see body, background color, pink. Okay, now if I go into my home page and I change this color to something like blue, okay, and I save this, now my index.css sees that change. But the less watch compiler is only watching this index.less file. So unless these files are imported through this index.less file, they won't get compiled. Okay, does that make sense to everyone? Let me just put a thread here. Does it make sense how the import is working? Okay, give me a thumbs down if it doesn't, and I'm gonna try to go through that again. I think it's important to understand how this is working. Okay, so we do have a couple thumbs down, so I'm just going to go through it one more time. So your less watch compiler, the command we ran was less watch compiler less css index.less. So we're only telling the less watch compiler to watch one file. We're saying watch our index.less file, and whatever is in that file, I want you to compile it into our index.css file. Okay? So we are just looking at this file here. What this import rule is doing is saying index.less, go and check for changes in variables, mixins, reset, and homepage, and pass those changes through to index.css in this order. So land in this order. So variables and mixins get consumed by the compiler, so that the order doesn't really matter. Here we're saying first the reset is going to land on the page, and then the home page styles are going to land on the index.css. Okay, because remember this index.css, that's the file that we're loading onto the server. This is what our internet browser is reading. It's not reading less. We're just writing our code in less. We're translating it back into CSS, and this translated file is what our browser is actually reading. And so here we're telling the order in which this should be translated. So first the reset, then the home page, then whatever is next. So should be global actually after the reset. So we should say at import global. Okay, so those would be our global styles. So if we save that, then we have our reset, and the next thing here should be our global styles. Okay, so I hope that makes a little bit more sense now. If your index.css is empty, please make sure that you've imported things into your index.less file. You won't see anything land on your CSS file until these imports are done. That's why you're importing first before you're working in these files. Okay? All right, I'm gonna see if there's more questions here. When creating new projects, would you create all of your HTML first and then make your less files, or just plan ahead and create them in the beginning? So I personally like to plan my projects out before I start building them. And I think most developers do this. It's gonna save you a ton of time later when you have to go back and delete all your code and rewrite it 50 times because maybe you didn't plan accordingly. So I like to plan my style, or like to plan my whole website first. So for example, I would take this homepage design file, and I would start mocking it up. So I would say, like, this is the header. Okay, this might be section 1. This might be section 2, and so on. Inside of the header, I have a navigation. Inside of the navigation, I have a logo or a title and some links. Okay, I would even be planning in my head right now that these I'm probably going to put in their own divs, because I'm going to use display flex and then space between to get those things to separate. This is an image. Okay, I know that I have a border here, so the border is probably going on my header. I've got another div here probably with my text inside of it. This is probably an H2. This is probably a paragraph. Okay, so I'm planning all of these things before I start coding. And at the same time that I'm marking up all of my HTML, I would probably go and create those corresponding less files. So I would say, okay, I need a header.less. Excuse my terrible typing on a mouse pad. Okay, I need a header.less. Maybe I can put all of these in one less file. So maybe I need a homepage.less. Okay. Personally, I would probably break those up into separate files. Okay. I know that I need a variable file and a mixin file, so I would probably just go ahead and create those. I would go ahead and create my index.less file. But the point here is, like, the more planning you do up front, the less room for error when you actually start writing your code. So although it takes a bit more time to plan, it will save you time debugging when you start coding. So really good question. All right, let's see. So less is essentially just a way to make things more organized. Yeah, pretty much. It is just a way to write more efficient code. So that button example, where you have to create 100 different buttons across 50 different pages, if we go back and we compile that into CSS, so view compiled CSS, notice how much more code we have. So that code is repeated. Okay, so for every button. So we have cancel hover, we have cancel, we've got a media query for each cancel button, we've got check-in, we've got check-in hover, a media query for each check-in button. So we've basically rewritten that code for all 3 buttons rather than just writing it once and then calling that reusable code in. I kind of like to think of parametric mixins as like puzzle pieces or like little snippets of code that I can plug in where I need them rather than having to write the same thing over and over and over again. But yeah, it is just a way to write code more efficiently. At the end of the day, it gets translated back into CSS, and that's what your browser's reading. Can you elaborate on consumed by the compiler? So consumed by the compiler means that it gets translated back into CSS. If it is consumed, it means that you won't see it in your CSS file. It just gets translated into code. So for example, our variables here are consumed by the compiler. So when we view the compiled CSS, notice that our variables no longer exist. And anywhere that our variables were plugged in, we now have the color that was stored in the variable. Okay, so that is what I mean by it's consumed by the compiler. So it just gets translated back into regular old CSS. Do the majority of all companies use less since it makes everything more organized? And if not, what are the scenarios that they may choose vanilla CSS over less? Honestly, it's hard to answer that question because it's super company specific. I would say most companies use a preprocessor of some sort. So whether that's less, whether that's SAS, whether that's one of the other big 5 preprocessors, why a company would choose vanilla CSS over less, I don't have a good answer for that. If you're creating big websites and big applications, you most likely want to be using a preprocessor. It just makes writing your code more efficient. Okay, we have 30 minutes left, so I'd really like to go over one more time everything we've learned with less. So starting with nesting, because I think that that is still kind of difficult for some people. The easiest way to do that might just be by starting a little website from scratch. So let's open up a code pen. And we're just going to open up a blank pen. We'll call this review. Save. And I can actually open up this link and just give it to you guys. There you go. Okay, so go ahead and open up that link. Let's just make a very, very simple website with like a header a section and a footer. So I'm gonna minimize JavaScript. Here we can say header. We'll give a navigation inside of the header. We can do a logo. Web31. And we'll do 3 links. So link, div.link. Home. About. And we'll say contact. Okay. And we can put an H2 inside of the header. Oops. We can say Web31 is the best cohort ever. Okay. And then we want to make a section. We'll make an H2 and we'll say about Web31. Okay, we'll give it a paragraph with some lorem ipsum. I'm going to save this so far just in case you haven't been able to keep up with that typing. And we're going to make another section here. Actually, we'll just make a footer. We'll keep it simple. And we'll make a button and we'll say, contact us to hire us. Okay. So go ahead and refresh that link and you've got all of your HTML. Okay, so we're gonna change this CSS to less. So if we go into settings and we click on CSS, we can pick less as a preprocessor. We can save and close. Okay, and the first thing I want to do is create some variables here. So at main dash color, and what should be our main color? So whoever responds to that thread first, I'm going to pick that color as our main color. Oh, perfect. Red. Cool. Let's get a special shade of red, Neil Orange Peel. So we'll pick an accent color too. Okay, let's take this dark red. That will be our cohort color. Okay, accent. Let's choose a nice accent color here. We'll choose this linen color. Okay, so we've got a couple of variables. We want to start writing some styles here. So I'm going to write our reset first. We don't want to nest this because it's just general. Padding 0, margin 0, border 1 pixel, solid gray, just so we can see where everything stops and starts. Another general style I'd like to add here is some line height on my body. So line height, we'll say 1.5. That takes the font size and it multiplies it by 1.5. We can add a font size here, 62.5%. And we will say body, font dash size, 1.8 rem, which is 18 pixels. And we can make our headings bigger. H2. I don't think we have an H3, but we'll put it just in case we add one. Font dash size, say 2.5 rem. Okay. So let's start laying out our website. And this is where we would probably start nesting. So I'm going to write styles for my header. If I had the option to work in separate files here, this is where I would start writing in my separate files. So I would put my variables in a variable file. So these go in the variable file. Okay, mix-ins would probably, if we create mix-ins, we're going to put them here. Okay, reset. General styles. Also like to add some padding to my sections. 4% 0 section, header, footer. Okay, just add a little bit of space. Okay, and then header, section, styles. Okay, let's talk about nesting. So what is nested inside of the header is my navigation. What's nested inside of my navigation is two divs, one with the class of logo, one with the class of links. Nested inside of the class of logo is the H1. Nested inside of the class of links is 3 anchor links. So first things first, my header section styles. I'm going to give my header a height, 90 VH. Okay, I am also going to give my header a background color. Okay, we'll say at main color. Okay. If I have my nav, I'm going to style that next. So nav, and this is where I would start writing these comments. So this closes the header. This closes the nav. Okay. For my nav, I want to use display flex. Let's go ahead and make a mix-in for that. We'll call the mix-in flexin. So just display flex is always going to exist in this mix-in. And then we want to say flex direction. Okay, and we can give this a parameter. And justify content. Justify. Okay, so we'll say at direction, at justify. Okay, and we can also say at align, and let's add align items as well. Okay, let's hard code center for align items. That way we don't always have to include it unless we want to make it something other than center. Okay, on my nav, I'm going to use flexbox. So I'm just going to call flexin, and I'm going to say row and space between. Okay, save. And center. Flexin, row, space between center, and then my semicolon. And I've got an error somewhere here. Where is my error? I have a typo. Where is my typo? Flexin, space between, row, center. Where's my type in? Can you tell me? In justify? Justify content at justify at justify. Thank you. Okay. Awesome. So now these things are lined up. I also want to put display flex on my links. My links are inside of my nav, so dot links. Okay. This closes links. Okay, we're going to say width 60%. Flexin. So row space evenly. There we go. Save. Then Web31 is the best cohort ever. We want, let's text align that center and add some margin on the top. So that is not inside of our nav, that's inside of our header. Okay, so now we've got to go outside of the nav. And now we can say H2, text align center. Okay, margin top. Okay, maybe 15%. Okay, looks a little better. If I want to change the color of the links inside of the nav, I can also say color at accent color. Okay, maybe I've got to get more specific here. I need that. Yeah, I've got to get more specific here. So now I can say A, color at accent color. This closes the A links. Okay. Then we can go and do the next section. Okay, so about section, styles, footer, section, styles. Before we move on, I'm gonna get a thread here, questions about nesting. So any lingering questions we still have about nesting and how that works? Okay, we've got a thumbs up. I hope that means we're all good. So when you're wondering where to nest something, I want you to look at what its parent is and then find the opening and closing curly bracket for its parent and make sure it's just inside of that opening and closing curly bracket, okay? So in this case, the A link is inside of the div with the class of links. So notice that this closes the A link and it's nested inside of links. So this is the style for links. And you can add comments, you can add space, you can do whatever you need to do here to make sure that this is readable for you and that you're keeping yourself organized. Okay, let's wrap a div around this stuff so that we can style it. Okay, I'm going to give this div a class of text. Let's fix the spacing here. We'll say Shift Tab. Okay, how do I link to the About section? So how do I link to the About section in my nav? So I'm calling hashtag about here. How would I make that jump down to the About section? Well, what would I need to do to make that work? Yeah, I would need to add an ID. So this is where adding an ID would be appropriate. Okay, so here ID equals home. The About section, it's going to go in the opening tag. ID equals about, and ID equals contact. Okay, so IDs, really they're most appropriate when I'm anchoring to different parts of my website. Okay, so when I am wanting that to jump to the About section, for example. They're not as efficient as classes for styling because we can only use an ID once on the page. So now that I've used the ID of home, I can't give any other element on the page an ID of home. So not so efficient for styling because we want to reuse styles over and over and over again. Okay, we can call that flex and mix in on the About section. So if we said hashtag about dot flexin. Okay, so the first one was flex direction, so row is fine. We want to do center and center. Okay, and then now we want to give that text class a width so that it gets centered inside of our section. So let's say dot text. Make sure it was called text, yep. And then width, and let's say 80%. Okay, so now it's centered inside of our section here. We can actually add some padding if we want to make it a little bigger. So let's say 4%. Okay, and that gets applied to the top right, bottom left. Okay, let's make that section background dash color at main dash color. Okay, and if we wanted our text to be our accent color, we could say color accent at accent dash color. Okay, this is why storing these things in a variable is super useful. So now I don't have to worry about memorizing these hex codes and which one is for the main color and which one is for the accent color. I can just call in main color or accent color, whichever one I want to use. Okay, we can even make the background of the About section to be that accent color. Background color. Okay. Let's call the H2 inside of text. So this closes text dot text H2 text align center. Okay, and margin, say 4% 0. Okay, add some space there. Okay, if we wanted that H2 to be our accent color up here as well, we could also do that. So color at accent color. Okay, and then finally our footer, and then we can start writing some media queries, and we can nest those media queries as well. So we can say footer background dash color at main dash color. Okay, we want our button inside of our footer. We want to style that, so padding. Okay, and let's give it a border of 4 pixels, solid at accent color. we can make the background let's grab a different red. Dark red, let's grab this fire brick red. Okay, and then if we wanted to center it, we could use Flexin, row, center, center. Okay, and then let's go ahead and nest our hover as well. So ampersand colon hover, and we can just switch. So we can say background dash color at accent dash color, and we can say border 4 pixels solid, and we'll take this red color and we'll just switch them. Okay. So you get the point here. The only media query I'm going to write just to show you is I'm just going to get this to stack on mobile. So we'll write a media query for 400 pixels. So we can do that with our escaping. We can say at phone, tilde, single or double quotes, max dash width, 400 pixels. Okay, we can come down here to our nav. We're going to nest that media query inside of our navigation. So we can say at media, at phone. This closes the media query for the nav. Okay, we can also use Flexin. Okay, but now instead of row, we're going to say column. We can say center and center. Okay, so now if I scroll down to 400 pixels, now my navigation stacks. Okay, I'm going to stop here and I'm going to see if there's any final questions. So if you're still a bit unsure about how we do any of this stuff, please get those questions into Slido so that we have a chance to review them before you start your project today. Okay, otherwise, if we are good to go, just remember that you are following the directions on the README file carefully for how you're calling in your imports. So first, you're going to import everything in this order. Then you're going to start working on your desktop. You're going to build the navigation. You're going to use the navigation.less to style it. You're going to update any styles as needed, and then you're going to make it responsive. Okay? It doesn't look like there's any more questions. I'm going to stop here. If you're still unsure about anything, but you are too shy to ask in the guided project, please ask in the help channel so that we can help you and we can make sure that you're really clear with all of this stuff and that you're ready to move on to JavaScript tomorrow and you don't have any lingering questions about HTML, CSS, or less. Okay, so I want to make sure we address all of those questions today. All right, go and enjoy your lunch, and we'll see you after lunch in the help channel.